in that model, then how does the Roman people look at themselves? How do they look at identity? How do they look at themselves in relation to the kind of like expanding empire that they're now building? If you were to ask someone back then, what does it mean to be a Roman? What's some of the things that they would say?
Yeah, so I think that what they would say is it's a political identity, but it's a political identity that's expansive and doesn't make them give up other aspects of their identity. So, like when Philo of Alexandria, who is this Jewish intellectual, talks about what Augustus creates, he says, "Look, like he creates a Roman citizenship that also allows us to be Jewish." And so we are totally Roman, right? We're excited about imperial power. We're excited about this structure. But, he doesn't make us worship gods that are not our gods. He doesn't make us change our eating habits so that we don't keep kosher anymore. He doesn't make us change anything about being Jewish. He just gives us some other aspect so we can identify and participate and be enthusiastic about this political participation that we have as a Roman. And I think what you see across the period of this 200 years before universal citizenship is extended is the people who get this position as a Roman citizen, as a sort of member, a full member in this political community, are enthusiastic about it. They realize they've been given something. But you also see a very interesting dynamic among the people who already have that Roman citizenship. So, like, I think in the United States, one of the things that you sometimes see is um, the immigrant community that was stigmatized and sort of seen as other. Once there is a new group that comes in, they then become, in a sense, the most kind of aggressively protective of their American identity. So in the early 19th century, you have lots of Germans who come in, and then you have waves of Irish migration, and you have tension between, the German and Irish, because the Irish are newcomers, and therefore you're going to, target the Irish. And then you have Irish and Southern Europeans, and then you have, Southern Europeans and people from, say, other parts of the world, starting with the immigration reforms of the 1960s. And so you just see like each group that has achieved this membership becomes intensely protective of what they've achieved. And they begin to then sort of shift to, well, we're suspicious of the next people who are getting this. And you see that in Rome. So in the 80s BC, there is an extension of Roman citizenship from sort of the people who are like core Roman citizens to everybody in Italy. And the people who really push back against the next wave of extensions of citizenship are people descended from those Italians who got citizenship in the 80s. And then you see a sort of further pushback against like people from Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean, starting in like the 90s AD by the people who got citizenship, under the Julio Claudius, under Augustus and his successors. And so it's actually a very familiar pattern that we can recognize in our world too, right? It is seen as an achievement to be fully politically integrated, and to have that kind of seamless understanding of like we belong in this political space. And then you have this kind of weird constant pushback against whoever the new people are. And so it's in a way something we can very much understand when you have like um, the satirist Juvenal talking about how the Orontes River, which is a river in Syria, is now emptying into Rome because there are all these weird people from Syria doing all this weird stuff. And you look at it and you're like, yeah, but Juvenal, like your family is, like, you weren't there in 500 BC, like your family is also a set of newcomers. You're pushing back against something because you value that status that you possess. And in 50 years, those people who you are targeting, their children will be targeting somebody else because this is just how that process unfolds.
I think, yeah, you're completely right. I think it says something about human nature when that becomes the kind of prevalent theme in this, even for thousands of years, and we're looking today, that's still the case because it kind of feels like once you're in the in group, you want to be just like, okay, let's keep it as it is, and then
Yeah.
it's a continuous thing. But w one thing I want to talk about now is that openness that Rome had. I want to understand a little bit more about that. Was that something that they had to do as a political strategy? Or was that something that they were forced to do because of the expansion that they were going on? You know, like you talk about the religion the freedom of the religion that they had. This is something that I'm guessing that once they took a place, they allowed the place to keep the religion. Was this a form of like a tactical strategy, or was it like a altruistic, we actually want you to be yourself kind of a position?
I think there's a couple things. I mean, I think there's one aspect is the part of Italy that Rome kind of grows up in is intensely multicultural, right? There's lots and lots of different languages, there's lots and lots of different backgrounds, and it's also extremely unsettled in the period when the Roman state really takes shape. So under the Roman monarchy, it's very, very, there's lots of people just moving around. And you can't be a closed off city because there's just too much else going on. But so that's like a historical reality. But Romans don't talk about this in that sense of the historical reality. They basically say this is what we have always been. And so their stories of their foundation are, their stories of the foundation of Rome, in a sense, don't make a ton of sense, right? Because you have this one story is the story of Aeneas, who's a refugee from Troy, and so he is the founder of the Roman community, but he actually comes from somewhere else. And he is restarting his life in this new space. He doesn't actually found Rome. He founds the city from which Romulus and Remus ultimately will leave to found Rome. But Romulus, too, when he founds the city of Rome, he founds it with some colonists, but he basically populates the city by first going around and finding these people who are discards from other communities in Italy. So these are, people who are indebted and run away. These are criminals. These are exiles, right? These are the people that other communities didn't have any space for and didn't want. And Romulus says, hey, there's a home for you. And then, because most of these people are men, you have this story of he opens the city up for, kind of welcome to Rome party, and the neighboring Sabines bring, their entire families, and they kidnap the women, and the women are then forcibly married to these Roman men. And they fight a war, but then the war is resolved by integrating the communities and saying, in essence, well, okay, the Sabine women and their children are now fully part of our community. And so from the very outset, this is a community that involves taking in new people. And so Romans would say, yeah, I mean, is this politically advantageous? Yes. Um, do we acknowledge that we look at what's going on around us and we see that, hey, these people fight wars in a way that's better than we fight wars? Let's learn from it. Yes. But is this like cynical? No, this is just who we are. This is who we've always been. And so you have lots of moments where Romans say, yeah, like we as a people take in and incorporate and don't send back these newcomers. So, you have these early stories of the foundation of Rome. You have a speech that the Emperor Claudius gives when he expands the Roman Senate in 48 AD, where he says, look, like this is what we do, right? One of our kings was actually born a slave, and he came in, and we brought him in as our leader because he was the best qualified person to do this. You even see it, I mean, if we go much later, you even see it in, say, the later part of the book, where you have like in the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries discussions of like, we're making a peace treaty with somebody, they're asking for us to take, to send back people who have gotten basically sanctuary in Roman territory. Um, and the pushback is always, we as Romans don't do that, right? If people come to our territory, they become part of us. We don't separate them out because someone else asked for them to be returned, right? If you come and become Roman, you are Roman as much as somebody who's descended from, say, a family that's been here for 1,000 years. And so it's true at the beginning of Roman history. It's true at the end of Roman history. And it's also something that Romans continually remind themselves throughout Roman history is, this is who we are. This is how we have always done things. And we can't make exceptions or change things just because it's expeditious at a particular moment.
That's such a beautiful idea, though, and I think that's kind of even to this day. We look at Rome, we look at some of the things that they've done. I think that's something that we as a society look back then and we try to see and we try to just definitely emulate. But I want to talk about some of the limits of that level of integration. Was that a thing? Did that become an issue later on? Was there any conversations about it diluting the identity of Rome as an empire, or was there like how did it develop as the time went on?
Yeah, you do have moments where people say this is happening too fast. And so, and so you do have, so I think this is why it's really important for Romans, and it's really important for us to understand that Romans believed that you need to integrate, but you don't replace, right? So so what you have to do is bring in new, but also remain tied to the traditions that defined you in the past. And so new can mean people, it can mean ideas, it can mean technologies, it can mean approaches, it can mean practices and medical advances. All of these things are welcome in Roman society as long as they don't fundamentally break the tie to what made Rome successful in the past. And there are moments where people say, yeah, it's moving too fast. And some of those moments are like ridiculous, right? So there's a guy, there's a major military victory in the Eastern Mediterranean where the Romans basically steal a bunch of stuff from wealthy cities around the Aegean and they bring them back in. There's a triumphal procession where they're displaying all the stuff they stole. And one of the things they steal is one-legged like pedestal tables, right, with one leg. And you have somebody who says, well, the decline of Rome has now started because Romans now are using pedestal tables instead of tables with four legs. And you look at that and you're like, okay, that's just ridiculous, right? Like that's the stupidest thing ever. But you do have reactions like that by people who say, well, there's too much, Greek influence in the second century BC. So we need to kick out all the Greek doctors and philosophers and rhetoricians and get rid of all this Greek influence because it's going to destroy what makes Rome what Rome is. Um, that's stupid, but it does highlight a real tension in Roman society where things are changing too quickly and people are feeling like, they're disoriented because they don't understand how the world they grew up in connects to the world they're living in now. But I think what you also see in Roman history is like those moments, they tend to kind of stabilize. So the guy who's really most aggressive in pushing against Greek influence is a guy named Cato. So this is Cato the Elder, who is like, oh, let's get rid of all of the Greek philosophers and Greek teachers and Greek thinkers, and like let's get rid of Greek influence. To the point where he actually lets like some of his family members die of diseases that Greek medicine could have treated because, well, like we Romans, we use like herbs. We don't use, medical treatment. But then one of Cato's descendants, Cato the Younger, actually is one of the leading Stoic philosophers in Roman history. And Stoicism is a Greek philosophy, right? So his ancestors trying to kick out the very people who are bringing in the ideas that are ultimately going to guide the lifetime of Cato, guide the lifestyle and approaches of Cato the Younger. So it's the same family. And just in the course of a few generations, you have something move from being so weird that you're advocating for it to be eliminated to almost 80 years later you have someone from the same family guiding their life by this. It's really, really remarkable, and I think that's also a lesson for us, right? These moments, and I think in a lot of countries we're seeing this like really intense reaction against what seems like a set of processes that are unfolding so quickly that people don't really see the connection of the modern world to the world they grew up in. That will stabilize. I mean, Rome shows that that can stabilize, and it does stabilize. And ultimately, what comes out of it is something better, something stronger, and not something that's not Roman. Just a different version of a Romanness that still is tied to that tradition.
Absolutely, and I think what you just said there, that sentence, a couple of sentences, is exactly the reason that I wanted to have this conversation. I wanted to be able to look at what happened in Rome and how they developed over time, and all the things that they were able to achieve, and how the people were reacting to this. Because I feel like we're going through sort of a similar kind of trajectory right now, and there's a reaction, there's a kind of that feeling of like there's a loss of identity. But I see in all the history that I look that identity doesn't it's not stationary. It's a thing that changes over time
Yeah.
and it reforms and it becomes something new. And to see the Romans do it and to see them do it all the way back then and to see how they, in all those different iterations change and become something new for themselves gives us hope and sees that maybe it can be also done here. A question I had too was that how on that kind of in the back of the idea, how likely do you think the flexibility of Rome can be applied to like a modern state?